One would certainly hope that the study of geopolitics would be a little bit more interesting and at least a little bit more ethical than the guy who tries to sell you a timeshare after you've just gotten through customs after landing at the airport. You know the guy, and if you don't know the guy, you probably know at least one salesman like him. He's the guy where just as you've landed and you're getting ready to enjoy this great vacation with your family, he sees you as a mark with the potential to make him a lot of money. Now, of course, he can't come out and say that right off the bat, so at first he's all smiles and all happiness. And he might even start by trying to give you something small for free. I was recently in Mexico. One of them gave me a free shot of tequila. But ultimately, they end up at the point where they are trying to convince you to tour their timeshare, and they're trying to frame it as a massive benefit to you. Now, of course, in reality, it's probably not a massive benefit. You're here on vacation, you only have a couple of days. Touring their timeshare is going to take up a huge portion of your time. More than that, the ultimate goal isn't to give you a free tour, but it's to sell you an extremely expensive contract that you're going to have a very difficult time getting out of. Now, the salesman knows all of this the whole time. He knows that they're trying to take advantage of you. But he can't tell you that because his goal isn't to do anything good for you. His goal is to make a lot of money for himself. Now, in order to do that, of course, he has to act like everything he's doing is in your benefit. Everything he's doing is actually to help you out. He has just selflessly put himself in this seat in this airport to talk to you because he's just so passionate about helping people. And a lot of people fall for it. A lot of people take the bait, but in hindsight, when they look back and they analyze the encounter and they analyze everything that has happened, they realize that they have been taken advantage of, and that all the time, this person was seeking only their own benefit. This is, of course, how salesmen work, and this is, in fact, how most people work when their goal is to get something out of you, at least if they're good at it. They can't just come out at the forefront and be honest about their intentions, because if they are, they know that you won't stick around for even the first phase of the conversation. So they have to trap you into a process where you feel already committed, already involved, before they start making the asks that reveal their true intentions. And once their true intentions are revealed, that's when they stop playing Mr. Nice Guy and they start playing hardball to try to really get what they want. Now again, when it comes to geopolitics, you would hope to see something a little more interesting than this. And you should definitely demand to see something a whole lot more ethical than this, especially when it comes to geopolitics related to a war where literally hundreds of thousands of people are dying. And you would certainly hope that the peace negotiations for this war were something more than just a run-of-the-mill scam happening at a larger and more sophisticated scale. And you would certainly hope that when examining the actions of a U.S. president, that you could put down some of the barriers that you would put up when talking to a common run-of-the-mill street peddler. Unfortunately, that might not be the case. Today I have to discuss the next chapter, and almost certainly not the final chapter, in the Ukraine war peace process, which is turning out to be one of the most frustrating peace processes in all of human history. And trust me, that is saying a lot. Unfortunately, I had to start this analysis with the timeshare analogy because it is valid. Here again, at this stage of the Ukraine ceasefire process with Russia, as I have noted so many times before, we find yet again the United States randomly inserting a token of ill will, intended not to benefit either Ukraine or Russia, who are the main parties in the ceasefire process, but instead only intended to benefit the United States, which is slowing down what is supposed to be, at least according to the United States, a peace plan that is being negotiated with the intention of saving lives. But unfortunately, saving lives doesn't seem to be the real priority. Saving lives seems to be the pretext to create the opportunity to pursue the real priority, which is more American power and more American profits. And yes, this is stronger words than I normally use on this channel, but that's because this is the third video I've made on this topic where I have carefully chosen my words every time, and every time I have seen things get pushed further and further in this direction, and things become more and more clear. And so while I will still try to be as neutral and as balanced as possible, I also have to be honest. Throughout this video, I am going to analyze the words of the United States against how the actual facts line up against those words. And as I do that, I want you to remember the timeshare salesman analogy, where no salesman comes in and tells you their bad intentions, but after the fact, once you're out of the emotions of the moment, you can look back and pick those apart and see pretty clearly what they're trying to do. That's the case with the United States here as well. They are, of course, not going to broadcast their intentions. They are, of course, not going to say them out loud, but they can be very clearly identified when you just follow the logical train of thought and all of their actions, not just one or two of their actions, but the whole sequence of their actions and how everything fits together. However, all of that said, things are still not as bad as they could be. Sometimes it turns out that a timeshare salesman is trying to sell you a timeshare, but you also want a timeshare. And so you can still end up with something that you desire, even if the person who's trying to sell it to you is doing so with bad intentions. The right outcomes for the wrong reasons, and that's a possibility here. So with that in mind, what exactly is going on? Well, as everybody knows, Ukraine and Russia are negotiating a ceasefire right now. And I put that in quotes because in reality, it doesn't seem like Ukraine and Russia are trying to actually negotiate a ceasefire at all, but instead they are just trying to put up a good front and make a good face to make it seem like they are trying to negotiate a ceasefire. Ukraine and Russia, of course, have been at war for several years now, and for all of this time, they haven't really been willing to talk about peace, mainly because the conditions of the battlefield and the positions of both sides and their desires are not compatible with each other and are not compatible with peace. Each side has demands of the other that they're not yet willing to relent on and that they don't yet think they have to relent on because each side still thinks it is possible to militarily achieve its objectives. Nevertheless, since Donald Trump has taken office in the United States, both Ukraine and Russia have felt compelled to at least pretend like they are talking about peace. And this is for a couple of different reasons, but the main reason is that the United States could either hurt or help the war effort of either side, depending on what actions it takes. It remains to be seen if the United States could decisively end the war in the favor of either side based on what it is actually willing to do. It's certainly capable of ending the war, but the willpower probably isn't there. But nevertheless, what the United States does will create problems for either side, or could potentially create problems for either side, or could create benefit for either side. So each side has been forced to kind of play along with this charade. I say they're playing along with the charade because when you look at the specific details of all of the peace plans that they have sent back and forth to each other, or rather ceasefire plans, every single one of them, whether it comes from Ukraine or from Russia, contains positions that are impossible for the other side to accept, and so it's not a legitimate effort at peace. For example, when Ukraine sent their ceasefire agreement to Russia, they said that they wanted Russia to return the stolen Ukrainian children back to Ukraine in exchange, and that's just something that Russia cannot do without completely losing face and causing really big problems for itself. And in response, when Russia returned their ceasefire to Ukraine, it was one of the most ridiculous things the world has ever seen. Russia basically demanded that weapons shipments completely stop to Ukraine, that Ukraine limit the size of its military, and a lot of other crazy things. Basically, for a 30-day ceasefire, they were asking Ukraine to fully capitulate. Now, that's where we find ourselves today, where after a lot of this back and forth charade, Ukraine and Russia finally seem close to agreeing to what is perhaps the most pointless ceasefire ever. When Ukraine originally proposed a ceasefire to Russia, it was a full ceasefire of hostilities across the entire front line, something that was still pretty pointless because the war would just start again in 30 days, but at least for those 30 days, people's lives would be saved. But now Ukraine and Russia seem to be landing on something a whole lot more limited, or potentially landing on something, which is not striking each other's energy infrastructure. Now, let me just say that this is a ceasefire that seems like it is intended to capture news headlines and probably not much else. Because from Ukraine's perspective, there is little benefit in getting Russia to agree to stop attacking their energy infrastructure. The reason for that is that Russia has been trying very hard all winter to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and they have not been having success. The reason for that is that Ukraine has a lot of their air defense around the sensitive energy infrastructure, and they are able to very effectively thwart Russian assaults. So because Russia already wasn't being successful in attacking these targets, for Russia to agree to stop these assaults is basically like on the flip side, Ukraine recently removed some of their troops from Kursk. It's basically like Ukraine agreeing to remove their troops from Kursk in exchange for peace. They're just doing something that they were already going to do because they decided that that particular military objective wasn't working out and it wasn't worth the continued costs. It is basically a headline capturing ceasefire that doesn't change the nature of the battlefield. It just captures the current nature of the battlefield and portrays it as peace. However, in the context of all of this is where that shady timeshare salesman comes back into the picture. Because it is at this juncture that the United States once again inserts a random benefit for itself into the peace process that's supposed to be about ending the war between Ukraine and Russia. What happened was that on Trump's call with President Zelenskyy of Ukraine, as he was excitedly telling President Zelenskyy about Russia's terms and how they would stop striking Ukrainian energy infrastructure, he said something very telling about his real intentions. He said, "You know what? Your energy infrastructure would probably be a whole lot safer if the United States owned it." Now that is a shady comment for a lot of reasons. First of all, because it's not true. And second of all, because to achieve that, well, I'll get into it in a second. Really quickly here, I first want to pause because I know a lot of people are going to say, well, we should probably give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt for this. And I would feel that way too if this was the first time Donald Trump has done something like this in regards to this peace process. But it turns out that that's not the case. This is just the latest iteration of something that has been done over and over and over again, where U.S. interests have been put in place as a blocker before actually achieving real peace. What you have to remember is that these peace talks, they are a public negotiation, which means probably the most important details are not going to be captured in news headlines because the people conducting these talks don't necessarily want their true intentions out in the open, just like the timeshare salesman who starts off by greeting you with a smile. So in these peace talks, what you have to do to really understand them is not just to look at the content of the deals themselves, but you have to look at the words of the major players around them and the actions of the major players around them, and how those words and how those actions point to their own interests. And of course, all three sides in this negotiation, quote unquote, have their own interests. Russia has its interests. It wants to invade and capture Ukraine. That's where the war started in the first place. Ukraine has its interests. It wants to defend its territory and its national identity and its way of life. And the United States, of course, has its interests too, which increasingly seems like we want to make a lot of money and gain a lot of power, Perhaps for the country as a whole, perhaps for specific individuals within the country, perhaps both. Now, in previous videos, I would have approached that point more as a thesis, and in this video, I am still approaching it as a thesis, but I'm approaching it as a thesis with a whole lot more proof behind it. In fact, it's leaving the realm of thesis and getting into the realm of very strong theory. Because at every stage of these peace talks with Ukraine and Russia, the first thing that the United States has always engaged in before moving peace talks forward is a deal that can profit the U.S. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details because I have other videos covering this in extensive detail, but some of the main things, or the main thing, has been a minerals deal that the United States put up as a barrier to them continuing to help Ukraine. And this minerals deal, it turns out, is not actually a minerals deal. It's actually a reconstruction of Ukraine deal with a small subsection that applies to Ukraine's rare earth minerals, but also applies to pretty much every other valuable resource in Ukraine. Now, what we saw in the negotiations around this minerals deal, or rather this reconstruction deal disguised as a rare earth minerals deal, is that every time the Donald Trump administration came to a mutually agreed interest of moving forward with Ukraine, they then turned around and randomly started attacking Ukraine and acting like Ukraine was the worst country in the world. We saw a couple iterations of this where Trump called Zelenskyy a dictator and then he backed down, only to just a couple of days later bring Zelenskyy into the White House, and we all saw how that went down, where Donald Trump and J.D. Vance basically ambushed and attacked Zelenskyy, expelled him from the White House, and then stopped sending U.S. aid to Ukraine. Now, U.S. aid then resumed to Ukraine just about a week later, and again the United States shifted its tone, and the minerals deal was brought back on the table, but it wasn't brought to the signature block quite yet. Instead, things progressed to, again, try to make this a better deal for the United States. And that's why they were doing what they were doing. They were trying to flex their walkaway power on Ukraine so that they could get more concessions out of Ukraine in the future. And right now, it seems like they are far from done with that. Because again, the latest demand from the Trump administration is implied, but you know, what I said earlier, look at all the details, not just what's in the actual deal. And the latest demand is, hey, your energy infrastructure would sure be a whole lot safer if the United States owned it. Now, this energy demand might seem separate from the minerals deal at first, but actually they're both intricately connected. Because it turns out that the reason that this demand is coming up is because reportedly the Trump administration has realized that because Ukraine has been so demolished by Russia, that there is not actually enough energy infrastructure to support operations in the areas where the rare earth metals harvesting would go on and all the other valuable resource harvesting in Ukraine. And so in order to make that deal work, the United States will need energy. And the United States doesn't want to rely on Ukraine sending them that energy. The United States wants to control all of the pieces on the chessboard. However, where this gets at least a little bit interesting and potentially a little bit mutually favorable to Ukraine is that the key aspect here is the Zaporizhzhia power plant, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that is currently held by Russian soldiers. What seems to be being implied by Donald Trump is that in order to make the next step of this deal work, we need to get that power plant back in Ukrainian hands, and it needs to then be given over to American hands. That's the only way Trump and the United States can get what they want. At least it's the best way currently. Now, what that shows is at least a potential shift in tone where the United States might be willing to get behind Ukraine in a more significant way to achieve its own self-centered objectives. If that's the case, well, the United States sure wants peace in Ukraine. They sure don't want Ukrainian soldiers to die unless they have to take a power plant that the United States wants to own for itself. Under this scenario, of course, Ukraine would just be transferring ownership of the power plant from one occupier to a different occupier. It's basically a kind of extortion, but at least it is a little bit in Ukraine's benefit, where that power would be flowing into Ukraine, and a nuclear power plant generates a lot of energy. It's not just going to go to U.S. interests. It will go to other parts of Ukraine as well, so at least that's a win. Now, whether that is the ultimate goal of the United States or another goal like controlling all of Ukraine's energy infrastructure so that they can use it as a bargaining chip to force further things out of Ukraine in the future, that's hard to say. But what isn't hard to say is that the reason that is being given for the United States wanting control of Ukraine's energy infrastructure is a bad one, which is basically saying your energy infrastructure will be more safe if the United States owns it. The implication here is the same as what was implied with the rare earth metals deal, which is, well, if the United States has business interests in Ukraine, Russia isn't going to want to attack Ukraine because the United States will retaliate. But that's just simply not the case at all. All these business interests in Ukraine, while valuable, probably aren't as valuable as what it would cost for the United States to actually intervene in a major enough way to win the war. Furthermore, just because the United States owns businesses in Ukraine doesn't mean American personnel are going to be working there. That's probably not the case aside from a few managers or things like that. Most of the personnel would probably be Ukrainian so as to explicitly remove Americans from having risk of dying in this area if Russia invaded, and therefore removing risk of America being called to intervene. Even more than that, what American personnel was there would probably just be evacuated at the first signs of trouble to avoid that situation. So American business interests, whether it's around minerals, whether it's around infrastructure, whether it's around energy, is not a good enough reason for Ukraine to feel secure. It is not a security guarantee. A better security guarantee for Ukraine's energy infrastructure isn't to give it to the United States, but it's to just keep doing what they're already doing, which is setting up air defense systems and blocking Russian attacks. The United States, if it was really serious about securing this energy infrastructure, they wouldn't be demanding ownership of it. They would just be sending Ukraine sufficient volumes of Patriot missiles and other air defense capabilities to protect the energy infrastructure fully. But that's obviously not the United States' real goal. They're trying to poke and probe for areas of opportunity for themselves. Now, even more than this, Ukraine definitely should not be trusting any supposed U.S. security guarantees short of actual U.S. soldiers in Ukraine to protect them against Russia, because the United States has given Ukraine security guarantees before, and then we backed down on our word. I'm talking about the Budapest Memorandum, which was made intentionally vague and basically deceived Ukraine into giving Russia all of their nuclear weapons. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power in the world. And the United States was nervous about that. And so the United States convinced Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons, their main deterrent against the Russian invasion, to Russia in exchange for an agreement that Russia would never invade them, that nobody would ever invade them, actually, and that Russia and the United States would protect Ukraine if they were ever invaded or attacked by a nuclear power. So again, what we see here would be difficult to describe as a legitimate negotiation. What we see is probably not a legitimate effort at a ceasefire, not a legitimate effort at peace, but instead just an effort for the United States to continue to poke and probe for increased ultimate benefit to itself. That is frustrating. I get it. It's really frustrating to me, especially as an American, and frankly, it's embarrassing. But it's not all bad. There is still some potential benefit here for Ukraine, and that is this. If the United States sees itself as having an interest in Ukraine, that supporting Ukraine would help them to acquire, then support for Ukraine might actually come. Now, let me be clear that Ukraine should not trust the United States as a security guarantee for the United States to defend an existing interest in Ukraine. But if the United States sees itself as having an interest that investing in Ukraine will help them acquire, in other words, get the benefit up front, then that might actually lead to the United States getting behind Ukraine in a much more significant way. I hope this discussion was helpful for you guys, or at the very least, interesting. And if that's the case, before you go, can I ask you for a quick favor? If you enjoy my videos and you find my perspectives unique, that's probably because I don't draw my salary from a newspaper or any other organization. That gives me a lot of freedom of thought to poke and probe angles that others can't or just might be too afraid to explore. Now, if you appreciate that approach and that freedom of journalism and freedom of analysis, would you consider helping to continue to make that possible by becoming a supporter of this channel on Patreon? If you want to do that, you can scan the QR code on screen or follow the link in the description of this video. It's completely voluntary. It's just for people who want to support the channel to have a way to do so. Thank you so much to all of my patrons that have made these videos possible so far. I look forward to doing a whole lot more work for you guys in the future. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.